Usually on an evening like this, I talk off the cuff, but tonight I want to cite some material from my book, and since I was a reporter for a number of years, it would just be too ironic to misquote myself. So I've prepared a little something which I can repair to. One thing I'd like to start with is tell you how pleased I've been in doing the research for this book to be received by such spectacularly informed and helpful people at your archives and at your libraries around the state. I particularly remember Dawn Hampton in Rome, Georgia, and Miss Kitty Rutherford in Calhoun. They were really splendid for me, but the person I was particularly impressed by, and the location, and maybe, I hope, a number of you know it, is the Newashota State Historical Site, and presided over at that time by a Dr. Donna Meyer. And now, because of the budget constraints, I understand that all of these sites can be curtailed in some cases and even closed in others. But the Newashota site was a wonderful exhibition of what life was like among the Cherokees up until 1830s. And when I was there, you saw troops of Georgia school children coming through and really learning about their history in the most dramatic way, and they seemed enthralled by it. So this now is probably inappropriate, but I'd like to make a pitch for the support group. It's if you decide that you should support the Newashota site, you can reach it. This is all one word, friendsofgaparks.org, and then you designate Newashota as your chapter. So that's the end of my commercial. My own interest in the removal of the Cherokees started some years ago when I finished a book on the War of 1812. And it ended with a spectacular victory in New Orleans by Andrew Jackson. You know, one of the great military victories of all time. 2,500 British soldiers, badly led, I might say, and then 7 or 8 American casualties. You don't get that very often in any wars, and of course it made Jackson a huge legend among the American people, as well it might. So I have felt for a long time that because we usually get our American history in the 10th grade, and reluctantly, we miss the epic sweep of our own history. It's a great, great story, and that's what I've hoped to tell in my books. For example, you take George Washington. I think a case can be made without any chauvinism that Washington was one of the great men of all time, not just American history, a great, great man. And similarly, Jackson was a great general. Now, in doing my research, I found that writing about Jackson's life after his military exploits presented quite a different picture from from the celebration I really had enjoyed writing about when he succeeded so triumphantly. But the most troubling aspect of his presidency to me, and there were others, but one was his determination to force the Cherokee Nation off its land. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about tonight. I had already suspected, even before, that his very well-publicized sympathy for the common man sprung from a sense that Jackson had from an early age that the elites at the time, the Virginia planters and their allies in the North, looked down on him. And they did. Albert Gallatin, who is a Swiss and very sophisticated man who probably helped us stay afloat more than anyone else financially during the War of 1812. He summarized Jackson as a rough backwoodsman, and Thomas Jefferson was even more dismissive. He said he remembered his time in Congress, and he said he could never speak on account of the rashness of his feelings. I have seen him attempt it repeatedly and as often choke with rage. So it has seemed to me that Jackson was motivated in part by a desire to revenge himself on that kind of person. And he succeeded very much when he took on the Bank of the United States. You remember that he was opposed to it. He thought that it was run by grafters and rich people for their benefit, not for the country. He was able to destroy it temporarily and to put on its place what were dismissed as pet banks, little banks, in the various states. Now, I was happy to leave to economists the whole ins and outs of this story, but what we can't overlook is the fact that in the year after he left office, the economy suffered a huge collapse, and there was misery because of his victory. And I think in many ways the same thing happened with the Cherokees. He succeeded in his aim, but misery followed in its wake. One of the things that struck me, and I hadn't anticipated it at all, was that reading about this whole period and thinking about it and immersing myself in it, it brought up all kinds of questions about guilt. And I started to think about individual guilt, collective guilt, historical guilt, even geographical guilt. And I'd like to talk a little about that later with you this evening, because I think that those questions have relevance to our more recent history than the Cherokees. First, though, we could review, and I'm apologetic about this because many of you in a setting like this know this information very well, but for those who don't, for those like me who came late to the subject, we could review the state of the Cherokee Nation when Jackson appeared on the scene. 5 tribes had lived for centuries in this particular corner of the continent, and that was long before De Soto arrived from Spain in 1540. Later, we called them the 5 civilized tribes because they seemed to be the people who adapted best to the white culture. Besides the Cherokee, there were the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and the Creek. The Cherokees lived in the valleys of what are now Tennessee, Carolinas, and Georgia. Travelers who came to this section of the world in the mid-1700s found the Cherokees to be unusually attractive and amiable people. They were taller than the white settlers, and they spoke in a language that sounded to the European ear like singing. The Cherokee wives reveled in hard work. They tended to the communal farmland. They did all of the chores around. Their husbands hunted during the season, and then with their wives' encouragement, rested the rest of the year. So you can imagine that the early French traders found this very attractive, and they oftentimes took these soft-spoken women as wives. They also learned that they could strike a very hard bargain with the Cherokees by plying them with liquor. And when the English traders replaced the French, they brought rum with them. The Cherokees had developed an ethical code that held that anything was forgiven that you did when you were drunk, except murder. Murder was the one exception. Anything else, if you were drunk, that was reason enough.